60 Minutes Rewind.
The he in this story is David Kessler, who recently announced that he was stepping down as head of the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. The war in this story is the one he fought against the tobacco companies. Allied with defectors from the enemy camp, Kessler fought much of the war behind enemy lines. But the first place he went, before firing the first shot, couldn't have been more friendly.
You know where the first place we went?
Where?
Public library.
The public library.
I walked into the Library of Congress, and I sat down at the computer, and I typed the word nicotine.
And what he found were hundreds of references to obscure scientific publications about the drug-like effects of nicotine, all funded and published by the tobacco companies themselves.
They certainly were interested in nicotine. Why fund those studies if you're not interested?
The tobacco industry long maintained that as tar is lowered in cigarettes, nicotine comes down proportionally. To see if that was true, Kessler decided to take a hard look at the tobacco company's own published data and found that it wasn't.
What we saw was that tar levels had come down, but the nicotine levels had in fact raised.
Armed with that information, Kessler put together an investigative team of scientists and lawyers and former criminal investigators from the U.S. Army, Customs Service, and the Secret Service. Their mission? To find out if the tobacco companies were manipulating the nicotine level in tobacco. That would be important evidence that the tobacco companies, while lowering the tar in cigarettes, were intentionally designing their products to deliver what they knew their customers really wanted, the drug effect of nicotine. Proving that would establish FDA's jurisdiction over tobacco products. Kessler's first big break in the case came from, of all places, a cocktail party on Capitol Hill. A friend of his overheard a tobacco lobbyist.
And the one line that he heard was that it all begins in the fields.
It all begins in the fields.
The tobacco fields.
And what did that mean to you? Were you able to interpret that?
What it seemed to suggest was you could manipulate and control the nicotine levels by how you grew the plant. I soon went back to the library to brush up on my plant genetics.
While Kessler brushed up on his botany, his investigators got a tip from a confidential informant to look for a patent for a genetically engineered super nicotine tobacco plant.
So we started putting keywords into the computer, into the patent search. High nicotine. We kept on coming back with nothing. We realized we were using the U.S. patent databases. They're a little cheaper. We went then to the World Patent Index.
Wow.
And there we got back a hit.
It was for a patent filed by Brown and Williamson, the tobacco giant. And if you think it was easy to find the patent, listen to this. It was registered in Brazil, written in Portuguese, and filed in the Netherlands. What jumped out at Kessler were the words in the patent, 6%.
And even though I didn't understand the words around it, it was a flag.
What did 6% mean to you?
That was about twice the level of the nicotine of the highest flu cured in this country.
Boosting it by 100%.
By genetic engineering and genetic breeding practices. Here we had evidence.
Yeah, this was
Here
something
we had evidence
different.
that the naturally occurring levels of nicotine weren't good enough.
The next question was, had the tobacco companies used the patent to actually grow a super nicotine plant? To get the answer, FDA investigators zeroed in on a name that appeared in the patent, Janice Bravo, a co-inventor. Kessler's top investigator, Mitch Zeller, traced her to New Jersey.
It was like something out of a novel, only it was real. It was literally a dark and stormy night, and we pulled into her driveway, two government guys in a government car in dark suits. And
somehow they talked their way into her house. So what did you learn? What information did Janice Bravo give you that helped the investigation move along?
She brought that patent to life. She made that patent real. She told us that the plant was grown down in Brazil by a sister company of Brown and Williamson.
I guess the big question is, once you learned that they grew this down in Brazil, did they
get it back into this country and try to put it in cigarettes?
That was the question that we had to answer.
To find out, FDA investigators went to the U.S. Customs Service.
Customs has mainframe computers that keep records of entries. But with millions of entries every day, you're lucky to find out whether today or yesterday something came into this country, let alone several years ago. I mean, you try to put that into the customs computer and the building shakes for 6 hours.
And it certainly wouldn't have come in as genetically altered tobacco.
We had no idea. We had no idea whether there was evidence. We literally were looking for a needle in a haystack.
After combing through hundreds of thousands of import records in Savannah, Charleston, and other ports of entry, one of Kessler's investigators found the needle on page 4 of a 25-page customs record.
It says Project Y1.
Y1. That was the code name of the high nicotine plant.
And you knew the code name.
We knew the code name.
When Kessler confronted Brown and Williamson executives with the evidence, he says they admitted designing Y1 to deliver more nicotine than otherwise would be possible in a low-tar cigarette.
Was that an admission that they manipulated?
If spending millions of dollars to develop a high nicotine plant, if inserting a gene to up the nicotine quantities, sending those seeds to Brazil, shipping them back into this country, if that's not evidence of manipulation and control, I don't know what is.
Brown and Williamson executives admitted to Kessler that Y1 had been used in 5 of their cigarette brands, including Viceroy, Raleigh, and Raleigh Lights.
Are they still using it?
They say no.
Meanwhile, Kessler's investigation took another turn.
One day, we're sitting here, and we get a white envelope. Over the transom, no return address.
The envelope contained Brown and Williamson's very own leaf blender's manual that describes the effects of adding ammonia and other chemicals to tobacco.
So wait a minute. You have evidence that they had genetically altered the leaf, but now you have other evidence that they're adding chemicals to enhance the power of nicotine?
You know what freebasing is?
Yeah.
It's using certain chemicals to increase the potency of a drug. So not only was there evidence of genetic manipulation, here was evidence for the first time of chemical manipulation.
The FDA's key source on both the chemical manipulation of nicotine and Y1 was a confidential informant codenamed Research, who in reality was Jeffrey Wigand, the former vice president for research and development at Brown and Williamson, who talked to Mike Wallace earlier in the year. Brown and Williamson has since sued Wigand.
Now, Brown and Williamson says that Jeffrey Wigand is a fabricator, that he is not a truthful person, that he makes things up.
Y1 was real.
Confirmed.
Confirmed. Ammonia was real. Confirmed. The information that we got from Jeffrey Wigand was absolutely truthful.
Wigand wasn't the only whistleblower to talk to the FDA. There were several others, and the one thing Kessler says they all had in common was fear of the tobacco companies.
You're the man they codenamed Cigarette.
That's correct. That was my official code name.
One of the first whistleblowers was Victor DeNoble, a research scientist for Philip Morris. He was so nervous when the FDA contacted him that he said he'd meet with them only in a hotel lobby.
Why the public place?
I thought it was better for me because behind closed doors, Philip Morris could have basically said, we don't know what you told them. You've broken your secrecy agreement.
You really thought they would have found out if you met people in a secret place?
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, you believe that, or were you just being paranoid at that point?
I believe that. I knew as far back as 1986 that Philip Morris had been following me and taking pictures of me at research meetings. I had no reason to believe that they wouldn't be somewhere close by, and I didn't want to get sued.
What Philip Morris didn't want him to talk about were his experiments on rats that he says showed that nicotine had some of the same addictive properties of illegal drugs, like heroin and cocaine. When he tried to publish a paper on those findings, the company suppressed it.
Philip Morris, supervisors and lawyers, called Cigarette in and told him that the lab was to be shut down immediately, that the animals had to be killed.
Kessler also got hold of internal documents from Brown & Williamson and Philip Morris that spell out exactly what the industry knew about nicotine and when they knew it. Documents that say, quote, "We are then in the business of selling nicotine, an addictive drug." The cigarette will even preempt food in times of scarcity on the smoker's priority list. After the whole 2.5-year investigation, Kessler issued a set of regulations. But all it did was restrict the sale and advertising of tobacco products to young people when it could have done a lot more.
Why don't you seek a regulation on ammonia? And if it's enhancing nicotine and we know nicotine is addictive now, why don't you say we can't be adding ammonia to cigarettes anymore?
You just don't do national experiments. You don't know what would happen if you reduce the ammonia. Would people end up smoking more cigarettes, those who are addicted, to get the nicotine? It is very difficult. Once you have someone who's addicted, you need to be very careful. Our goal, and what I really think is the right public health approach, is to deal with the problem before the addiction sets in.
What he's talking about is stopping young people from starting. And even that narrow focus was no easy sell to the president, whose support he needed. Just ask the president's chief counsel at the time, retired federal judge Abner Mikva.
I know that there were Democratic office holders and other politicians, congressmen, governors, senators, who told the president face to face, "You'll lose the South, we'll lose the South if you push this tobacco issue." Sure.
He says a poll showing parents would support the regulations helped. But what tipped the balance for President Clinton was believing that if he didn't support the regulations, Kessler would quit.
And I think that the political calculation that finally prevailed is that whatever the politics are against doing anything about tobacco, the politics are much worse if we don't.
Because he'd resign and make a splash.
They'd make a splash.
And they'd say, this president
just caved into the tobacco industry, caved into the few Southern politicians that still run the roost. And
so in a way, he created a counter-political problem.
Absolutely, absolutely.
The tobacco companies are suing to overturn the regulations, and there's talk in Congress of a deal that would block FDA jurisdiction of tobacco. But Kessler, who's leaving, says he's not worried because now the evidence is out there.
When you look at a product like this, you have to look at it as an addictive drug.
Brown & Williamson, Philip Morris, and the other cigarette makers have consistently denied that they manipulate nicotine to hook smokers, or even that nicotine is addictive. They insist that it and other ingredients are used only to enhance the flavor of tobacco. We invited each of the tobacco companies to be interviewed for this broadcast, but they declined. You should also know, with regard to Jeffrey Wigand, the FDA whistleblower being sued by Brown & Williamson, CBS is covering his expenses in the lawsuit.